Link Joker focuses around locking, which is a new mechanic in Vanguard 0. This is where you flip a rearguard face down. It cannot be interacted with. That means you cannot place on top of it, it cannot be retired, and you cannot intercept with it. Link Joker is a very beloved clan, so I wanted to try to make a free-to-play deck around it, even though most of the really good units are obviously in the triple rare category. So the goal I set for myself was to try to take advantage of the offensive and the defensive capabilities of locking. Now, what I mean by that is locking is not a plus. Locking does not retire. That means the unit that you are flipping face down will be coming back eventually. So all you're doing is basically time walking the unit. You will not have to deal with it for another turn. Now, what I mean by the defensive power of locking is that the unit face down is not going to be of use to the opponent that turn. That entire circle will be turned off. If you're able to turn off a front row rearguard, that means that is one less attack coming your way. So the main way the deck is going to be locking is with Knight of Entropy. He is the generic double rare that almost every clan has, where on limit break he gets plus 5k, so he's a 15k attacker, and they have a win place counterblast too. His ability is obviously just lock an opponent's rearguard. 99% of the time you're going to be locking an opponent's front row rearguard with this. This means that they will have one less interceptor and one less attacker next turn. See, Knight of Entropy gives us a really good early game aggression because you don't need to be in limit break to start locking. Something to note is that Knight of Entropy, his locking is on place. Most units lock during the main phase or during the battle phase. This means he's going to have a little bit of trouble synergizing with other units in the deck that like when stuff is locked. This also means that late game, we're not going to really have a lot of locking pressure because that means we're going to have to continuously re-ride our Vanguard to continue the locking. Then the rest of the grade 3 slot is sadly just kind of the really bad 12k attackers, and I really do like the 15k attackers on Vanguard because then at least you have a pseudo backup ride. So you're probably noticing that there is one triple rare in this deck, which is Nebula Lord. The reason I'm okay with him being in the deck is because you get a free copy of him once you get to 50 shards in the game. So technically he is free to play. So I still wanted to include him just to be able to fill in the deck. He is Link Joker's only way of really plussing. So first off, he has Counterblast 1, lock one of the opponent's back row rearguards. This is a recurable effect, so you can lock all three of your opponent's back row if they have it. He also has the ability that each card in the front row is going to get plus 3k for every locked card the opponent has. This only triggers at the start of the battle phase, which means it won't trigger if anything is locked during the battle phase, which we'll talk about in a second. If you were able to lock three of the opponent's rearguards before the battle phase started, you are going to be able to draw a card. And like I said, locking is not plussing, so this is the only way to form advantage really with Link Joker. Now honestly, my favorite card in the grade 2 slot is the 10k vanilla. This is because since we're going to be sometimes locking our opponent's back rows, that means it's going to be harder for them to get over that 10k body, which is continuously proving the fact that locking is also a very defensive skill. I only have 3 copies of Mobius Breath. This is because I don't have a 4th. But that's totally fine. He has a Vanguard ability that on hit, you can lock an opponent's rearguard. Since it's on hit, that means you will not be able to lock the opponent's front row that easily. That is, unless they place like a grade 1 in the front row on their first turn. You will typically be using him to lock the opponent's starter. I play 4 copies of Singularity Sniper. I think this card is kind of hit or miss in the deck, because she can only lock an opponent's rearguard if there's already a locked rearguard. And since Knight of Entropy can only lock 1 unit, that means it's going to be harder to activate her ability. I still want her as a 4 of because the ability to lock without using any of our resources I think is very powerful. Now in this deck I'm only playing 2 Furious Claws. I think in most Link Joker decks you should be playing 3 or 4 copies of him. The only reason I'm only playing him as a 2 of is to give him the power gain off of Knight of Entropy. You had to have placed him in the back row during the previous turn because Knight of Entropy is just going to be on place, and laying grade 2s in the back row never feel that good. I still think he's a very powerful unit and should be played. It's just in this deck he's kind of harder to proc, so less copies of him just make it so that we get a less clunky hand. Now in the grade 1 slot we have the same unit basically as Sharpclaw. He's obviously a lot better here, that's why I'm playing him as a 4 of, because that means we can hide him in the back row while he's getting all this power gain. If you're able to lock one of your opponent's rearguards, he is now a 10k attacker, which can get over most interceptors. I'm only playing 1 Opener of the Dark Gates. She is basically the on-place discard draw. You just have to have your opponent have 2 or less rearguards, and if a card is locked, they don't count as a rearguard, so that's how you get that easier. Since we don't have the break ride in this deck, I don't think she's as important. so that's why I'm playing more copies of the 8K. But if you want more copies of her, that totally makes sense. Just cut out the 8K vanilla. Now I'm playing White Knight Fenrir as the starter. Since Unicorn got a nerf and can no longer lock the front row, I didn't think his ability was that useful now because he can only proc if an opponent has a lock card anyway. So at least with this guy, we can at least get a free card in our hand, which can possibly be a PG, possibly a Nebula Lord for late game, stuff like that. Now I'm just playing 9 draws because, like I said, there's no plussing. This makes it so we can draw into pieces a lot easier. And the deck doesn't really need crit pressure since we are able to deal multiple damage as long as the opponent has front row locked units. See, with like most of the videos I try to talk about like other budget options, but sadly with Link Joker there's not a lot of flexibility. The grade 2 Elk, which is the Libra clone, the on hit counterblast 2 draw card, is not that good in this deck. Even though the plussing is nice, the CB2 is just too high of a price to pay when you don't have any way of countercharging. The gravity line, just even the grade 0 to grade 2, is really cool because it does give you another way of locking. What I don't like about it is if you didn't get the ride chain perfectly, then the grade 2 has no way of doing anything. So in those cases, I would much rather just be playing the Mobius Breath because at least that's a guaranteed lock the starter. Now upgrades for the deck, obviously the break ride is probably the first thing you're going to want to craft for this deck. Him being able to lock 2 of the opponent's rear guard on ride for only counterblast 1 is really powerful. If you use it with Knight of Entropy, you're able to do like the perfect lock or whatever it's called, where you lock both the opponent's front row and then the booster for the Vanguard. This makes it so that the only thing able to tap the next turn is the Vanguard. Getting more copies of Nebula Lord is obviously going to help us get more advantage when it comes to consistent locking and consistent plussing. Now, Schweigt Shield Dragon is kind of in this weird spot. I think if you have copies of it, you should definitely play it, but I don't think you need to craft it. He's a very powerful unit, him being able to lock basically everything, and on top of that, gain crit pressure is really cool. He does cost 3 counterblast and a persona blast, which is super heavy. He does have a way of giving himself more copies of himself for the persona blast, but that also costs counterblast. So that's a total of 4 counterblast possibly, which means you won't be able to use him and Knight of Entropy in the same game. So I think him in the deck isn't going to hurt anything. Obviously, since we're playing like shitty 12k attackers, I just don't think you should be crafting him unless like obviously you really like him because he has his own deck obviously with the ride chain. So feel free to go down that route if you'd like. Just I don't recommend it. In most games when you're playing the deck, the opponent is really going to be able to counter our plays because Link Joker is a very predictable clan. They can just choose not to give us units to lock. They can choose just not to give us a lot of CB to use. It's really easy to avoid. If you're playing and the opponent accidentally crits or pressures you a little too hard, you're obviously able to pressure back in a really nice way. A fully powered Link Joker deck is still going to have trouble playing against an opponent that knows what you're doing. So playing this budget deck is going to be even harder, obviously. Basically, the biggest crutch is that late game, the deck does nothing. You're just going to have a really like slug crawl turn 4 onward. Now, with that said, my final thoughts is the deck is still really fun. I'm not the biggest Link Joker fan. Like, I'm a fan of Chaos Break in a certain way just because of like the control aesthetic. I'm not really a fan of the make it so your opponent can't do stuff. That's not that fun. But playing in the right way just feels like this really fun back and forth with the opponent. What I really like about this deck is it's super easy to put together. No pieces don't interact with each other. So there's no reason to not play a tripwire that you were able to pull just because it doesn't interact with the rest of the budget deck. I think you should just take this as like a skeleton of a deck and then fill in the pieces that you have. Please follow Triple Rare on Twitter, Instagram, wherever you want. I've been having a lot of fun making some really cool designs for the deck, especially with all the new like reverse units coming out. I have a couple other videos like in the works, but nothing like concrete, so expect stuff soonish. I never know how to end these. That's all I got.